All right, so next up, we've got a very important topic, which is the ChatGPT API. So this is an API that was announced, I think, a month or so ago. It's very new, in the middle of 2023. And it's an API that is based around a chat format where we provide messages and then we get responses. So if you're not familiar with ChatGPT, I assume almost all of you are, right? But OpenAI launched this chat-based product to interact with the GPT models, where I type something in, right, and I get a chat response, like help me feel less sad or something. I don't feel very sad, but let's just put that in there. And then I get a chat message back, and then I can keep sending messages and get a response. Well, if it's online, looks like it's struggling right now. Anyway, that has nothing to do with the API for us. The point here is that there is a separate API called the ChatGPT API that is set up to work in a chat-based format. And here you go. You can see that the ChatGPT client is responding to me like a chatbot does. But this ChatGPT API is very important to know about, even if you have no interest in making chat-based applications. You don't want to make chatbots, that's fine. You can use it to do that, but you can also use it for any single-turn tasks, anything we've done so far. Translation, text generation, write me a poem, tell me a joke, make me a color palette. Also, sentiment analysis, any of the applications we've seen so far with the completion API, where we just pass in a prompt and a model and we get a response. We can do the exact same stuff with the ChatGPT API, but the most important difference is that the ChatGPT API allows us to use GPT 3.5 Turbo and, if you have access, GPT-4. And as of now, for whatever reason, OpenAI has decided not to permit those models with the regular completion endpoint. So I have access to both of these, GPT-4 and GPT 3.5 Turbo. Here's a simple completion. Give me 3 trivia questions and answers. And the best model I can use is Text DaVinci 003. And I get my 3 questions and answers. I cannot do GPT 3.5 Turbo. I'll get an error. And the error says at the bottom down here, oh, well, this is a different error. Error communicating with OpenAI. Let's try that again. There we go. This is a chat model, not supported in the completions endpoint. So for whatever reason, they have limited these newer, fancier models to only work with the ChatGPT API. And there's not a lot of explanation as to why. I have a feeling maybe they're going to try and push people to use the ChatGPT API in place of the completion API. I don't really know. But the good news is the ChatGPT API can do everything we've already done, and we can use the fancier models. So that's why I'm going to show it to you, because, well, even if you don't care about chat, you probably care about using things like GPT-4, which was just released 2 days ago. I got access on the wait list, but I can't use it with completion. I can only use it with the chat endpoints. So in the next video, I'll show you how we do that. It's a slightly different format. It doesn't look the same as what you see here, but it works just as good, just as well. I'll show you in the next video. All right, so in the previous video, I explained that the ChatGPT API is new, it exists, it uses a chat-based format, and most importantly, it supports the newest models, including GPT-4, which the completion endpoints do not support at all at the moment. So how do we use it? Even if I just want to rewrite an existing completion query, something like this, where I'm asking it to tell me a joke, model is Text DaVinci 003, how do I do that using the ChatGPT API? Well, it's a little bit different. Using the Python client, it looks like this. OpenAI.chatCompletion.create, so chat completion instead of completion. Our model, so we could do GPT-4 if you have access to it, or GPT 3.5 Turbo, which everyone has access to, but you still can only use that with the chat completions. And then the most important difference is we don't pass through a prompt parameter. We pass through a series of messages. So in this case, it's just a single message, but we can pass through pages and pages of messages if we wanted to, if we had like a serious chatbot with lots of history, or just a single message like I have here. We specify a role and content properties in that corresponding dictionary or object or whatever language you're working in, some sort of key value pair. So again, this is the Python implementation using the Python client. It looks slightly different in JavaScript, but at the end of the day, it's always a series of messages that we provide to the chat completion API. So let's try it. Let's take this generate me 3 trivia questions and answers. That does work, assuming I use Text DaVinci 003 or any other model that is supported by the completion endpoint. But let's rewrite it down here to be an ChatGPT API request. So openai.chatCompletion.create, and then I specify the model. And I have access to GPT-4, so I'll use that. Although it's kind of going to be wasted. It is more expensive. I'm just using it to show you we can. I'm probably going to go back to using 3.5 Turbo. And if you don't have GPT-4, you can replace this with GPT 3.5 Turbo. But I'll do 4. And then we provide our messages, which is equal to a list. And it's a list of these dictionaries or objects or whatever you want to call these in whatever language you're working in. But in Python, it's a dictionary where we have a role. And we'll talk more about this in the next video, but just follow along. I'll set role to user and then content to, I'll take the same prompt we had here. Generate 3 trivia questions and answers. Okay. And I'll run it and we get a response. Okay. So we can see the response is in a different shape. Notice it's choices, which is a list, and each choice in here, there's only one, has a message property, and each message has content. So it's the same approach that we sent in, right, where it's messages, and each message has a role and content. I set the role to user, content to generate me 3 trivia questions and answers. It responds back with a series, in this case, a single message that says content, here's the content, and then role is assistant, meaning it came from the ChatGPT API. So it's a different format, but we're still getting the same sort of information. And again, I can use GPT-4 or GPT 3.5 Turbo, which I cannot use with the completion endpoint. So it's worth it to change the format a little bit. Even if we're not doing a chat-based thing, we just send a message in the format of a chat message, and we get a response in the format of a chat message, and then we can extract whatever we want out of there. So let's save this to a variable. We'll call this reply. And let's look at reply. Just run it again. And then let's extract the text that we actually want, the content out of there. So it's inside of choices, right? And then there's the first choice. There's only one. And then we want .message. So we have to burrow down a little more than we do with the completion endpoint, but message, and then I want the content property. And let's print that out. And we should be able to see our trivia questions printed out. And there we are. Trivia question 1, trivia question 2, trivia question 3. So in future videos in this section, basically the next video or two, I'll show you, that we can take existing completions and change them over to chat completions. This is not just for chat. Even the OpenAI documentation says that. If you go to the documentation, chat completion, you can see using the OpenAI chat API, you can build your own applications, blah, 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 blah. Draft an email, write Python code, do whatever you can do with the completion API, you can do it with the chat API. And they make it clear here, although it was designed to make chat conversations easy, you can do any sort of single-turn tasks that have nothing to do with text conversations. It's just the format that we use is a text conversation format, a chat conversation. Here's the message I'm sending you. Here's the message I got as a response. Okay, so in the next video, we'll see some more examples. Welcome back. So there's another thing I want to call your attention to when it comes to using the chat API and why you might prefer it over the completion API. Even if you have to kind of contort your queries to use the message-based format, it comes down to pricing. So the GPT 3.5 Turbo model, which only works as of right now in April of 2023. It only works on the chat endpoints. It does not work with the completion endpoints, is a factor of 10 cheaper than Text DaVinci 003. So it's cheaper, and it's also a newer model. It's supposed to be faster. It's more finely tuned. Not to mention, if you want to use GPT-4, you don't have a choice. You have to use the chat API, although it is the most expensive. So I will avoid using it until it actually makes sense. I mean, I've shown you it works already, but it doesn't really add much for most of our basic prompts. Anyway, just wanted to make that clear. It's not just about using a fancier model or something. It's 10 times cheaper if you use GPT 3.5 Turbo over Text DaVinci 003. But you can only do that, as we saw, if you're using the chat endpoint. So this query right here, getting 3 trivia questions, we get our 3 trivia questions. It's 10 times more expensive per token than, assuming I change this to 3.5 Turbo. Remember, GPT-4 is the most expensive, but 3.5 Turbo only works for the chat completion, and it's 10 times cheaper. And let's take a look at the results when this finishes. And here's our result. And we get 3 trivia questions and answers. They're very different. I didn't prompt it, in any way. I just said 3 generic trivia questions. So we can't really gauge the quality comparing them, but they seem comparable to me, right? Very good, simple trivia questions. And of course, we can try this with any other prompt. We're going to rewrite our color generating prompt in just a moment. But I want to just emphasize the price factor. I think that will matter for a lot of people. Even if you don't care about the performance benefits of 3.5 Turbo, it's 10 times cheaper, but it only works with the chat endpoint. So another reason to use the chat endpoint. Next up, I want to talk more about the chat API's format for messages. If you go to the documentation and you go to the chat completion page of the docs, scroll down, it talks a little bit about what we've already seen. The response format we get back is a little different from a regular text completion. But then keep going down, and it talks about how to provide instructions. And the way that we normally do this, here's the part I want to show you, comparing chat versus text completions, is if we had a text completion like this one, the prompt is translate the following English text to French. I don't know why I just said it so weird. The English text to French, and then we provide the text. We've seen how to do that using the regular text completion endpoint. With the chat API, the recommended way of setting this up is by providing a first message that sets the scene, essentially. So we'll use the role of system. There are 3 roles that we are recommended to use. There's the system role, the user role, and then we have the assistant role, which is basically text coming from the API itself. So in my experimentation, I found the system role doesn't actually do all that much. So I'll show you what I mean. If I take this set of messages, here's the document we've been working in, the notebook. I'll zoom in a bit more. Just make sure I rerun these cells. Okay. So I can make a chat completion, openai.chat completion. .create, and then I'll pass through these messages, and I'll use, just for pricing's sake, there's no reason for me to use GPT-4, I'll do 3.5 Turbo. And then I'll pass through the messages, just copied from the documentation right there. Okay? So messages is a list, as we've already seen, and each entry in this list contains a role, and it contains content. And the docs recommend starting with a system message, setting the stage. You are a helpful assistant that translates English to French. And then the user role is, if we're thinking in terms of a chatbot, it is the user asking a question, asking for information, right? Providing the user's information. And then the data that comes back will be in the assistant role. So if I run this, we get back message, here's the content. You can see role is assistant. And, oh, of course, I didn't even provide the text. Simple amateur mistake there. Let's provide some text. Translate the following English text to French. I want a pet frog. Okay. And here we are. Je veux, I have no idea if this is accurate or not, but there we are. We get our French back. And again, it says role is assistant. So this is used to indicate any message that is coming from the chatbot. User is for any message that is coming from a hypothetical user, even if it's just me or the developer. And system is used to sort of set the role and set the scene. But the point I want to make here is that in my experience, it doesn't really matter much what you provide in the system. I could get away with just doing this. If I cut this out, get rid of this system message, and just provide a single message. You are a helpful assistant that translates English to French. Translate the following English text to French. I want a pet frog. And we wait, and I get the same response. Role is assistant. It looks like it's slightly different. Yeah, slightly different because we're not getting the new line characters that we are getting new line characters here. We weren't getting them before, but I'm sure there's ways of tweaking that. My point is it still works. It's just two different ways of providing the prompt or the instructions. So I recommend, I'm going to try and follow this recommended route that the docs outline, where you start with the system message, but even on the docs, they show, or you can just use the user message. So the format is sort of flexible. I imagine as they develop the API further and release later models, the system role will play a more important purpose, or will have a more important role. At the moment, it seems like just a stylistic choice. And you start with this system message just conventionally, even if you don't have to, and then you provide a user message. Let's try one more quick example. Let's do some sentiment analysis. So if you recall, when we covered the completion API, we did some basic semantic analysis where we said something like, rate this text, the sentiment in this text as positive, neutral, or negative, or something like that. So I can do the same thing using the chat completion API. We just have a slightly different setup. So I'm going to follow the pattern of having my first message be a system message. System. And then the content will be something like, you are a helpful assistant that classifies the sentiment in text as either positive, neutral, or negative. So that's our first message. Don't forget the comma here. And then we have the actual content that we want it to analyze. So we'll say role as user this time, right? That's the actual information that we're going to provide. This will be our data. And then the content is classify the sentiment in the following text. And then we'll just do something stupid like, I really hate chickens. Okay. Let's try running it. And the sentiment in the text is negative. Now, of course, I can specify all sorts of format for how I get it back. I don't want this full sentence. The sentiment in the text is negative. There's a lot of options I have here. Right? I could just say only respond with the sentiment. That would be one example. Or I can provide some examples. So I can do this. Role as user. Here's your content. And then I can actually just show it. Here's what I expect the assistant to respond back with. And I'll just have it respond back with the word negative, if that's what I want. And then I can ask it for another piece of text, right? And hopefully it figures out, okay, the user asked me this, I, the assistant, and I'm, putting consciousness where there's no consciousness, but the role assistant, which is supposed to be the model response, came back with negative. So then this time through, hopefully it figures out what I actually want. And instead of I really hate chickens, it will be I love my dog. Okay, this is the most simple, boring sentiment analysis we could ever do, but let's see if it works. Check it out. Now it just gives me positive. So by saying the role is user and then the role is assistant, I'm providing an example. And it's just a slightly different format than what we did with the text completion API. Although we could also basically just have one long message where we provide examples and say, here's how you should respond. If I give you this text, you should respond this way. But we can also take advantage of the message's syntax and just provide examples where instead of one big message, we say, here's the user message. Here's what you should respond with. Here's another user message. Now your turn. And then it responds with assistant, and it figured out the pattern and just gave me a single word, which is positive. So So that's the message format. It is different, but it's pretty easy to pick up. And then remember that the returned information, the output, is slightly different, right? It comes back as a message where there's a content and role property. And usually we want the content property because the role will be set to assistant. This video is just a very quick note on the different models that we can use with the Chat API. So if you have access to GPT-4, if you've been approved on the waitlist, or hopefully by the time you see this video, there is no waitlist and the beta is over, you can use GPT-4, although as we've talked about, the price is significantly higher than GPT 3.5 Turbo. So I want to talk about GPT 3.5 Turbo. There are two different models here that both say GPT 3.5 Turbo. And you might think that this one that has 0301 at the end is the newest or the fanciest or the best version to use. That's actually not the case. As it says here, this is a snapshot of 3.5 Turbo from March 1st, 2023. It will not receive updates, and it's only going to be supported for a few months. You may be watching this after those months are over. So don't use this or any other version that is a snapshot unless you want that snapshot. But you're probably going to want to use GPT 3.5 Turbo, which is going to be updated as there are new iterations. And remember, it is a tenth the cost of Text DaVinci 003. So there's no real reason to use Text DaVinci 003 with the Chat API, as far as I can tell, unless you want to pay more money for a worse model. But when you're working with the Completion API, if you choose to do so, as it stands, you can't use 3.5 Turbo, you can't use GPT-4, so Text DaVinci is your best choice. And it's still not, it's pretty cheap. It's a matter of fractions and fractions of a cent for most queries. Okay? So that's all I wanted to say here. Stick with 3.5 Turbo. Don't add on any of this other stuff. Even if it seems like that's going to be better, it's not. Welcome back. The next thing I want to do is show you how to rewrite an existing, more complex prompt, like our color palette generating prompt. So what I've done is made a copy of the notebook that we made for the color palette generator. Remember, well, hopefully you watched some of that. We made a full project out of it with a Flask backend and some JavaScript on the front end, but we started just in a notebook. I wrote a function called getInRenderColors, and it's just a long prompt with the completion endpoint. So I gave some examples, and then the output I expect. Another example, the output I expect, and then the actual prompt itself. And so I can call it with getInRenderColors? Yes, getInRenderColors. And then I pass through a prompt, and let's just do, for Google brand colors. That's a good benchmark. And we get 4 little swatches based on the Google color palette. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite this using the Chat API. And the main reason, aside from just showing you how to do that, is that it's 10 times cheaper. And it's a better model if I'm using 3.5 Turbo. So might as well do it, right? Save money and maybe get some better output. Although we're not really going to notice much of a difference in my experience, except for the price, which is significant, 10 times cheaper. So definitely worth it. Okay. So the first thing we need to do is set up a messages list. And I'm going to do that. I'm not going to do it in line. I'm just going to do a list of messages that I then provide down when I make my chat completion. And our first message will be a role of system, right? And this just sort of gives it the general context. So the role is system, and the content will be this whole thing here. You are a color palette generating assistant, blah, 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 blah. The palette should be between 2 and 8 colors. So I'll cut this out here. There's one problem, which is this is part of a triple quoted string. And if I paste it into a single quoted string, Python's not going to be happy with it being on separate lines. So I can just put it all in a single line. There is a typo. It says your should. It should be you should. And then I'll do the same thing here. Just get it on one really long line just to start. Okay, and if I go to the end of that line, it's not showing me the very end, is it? Okay, and then I'll add the corresponding comma I need after that first message. And then we'll have our next message. And this message is going to be an example, right? We have Q&A format. Instead of doing that, I'm just going to say, here's what a user asked for. I showed this in the last video, where the user asks for this, convert the following into a color palette, and the prompt is the Mediterranean Sea. So I'll paste that in, go to the end of the line, add my comma again, and then I'll say the message I got back had a role of assistant, meaning you, the API, this is what you should have given me, which will be this color palette right here. And I'm putting it in single quotes because I'm using double quotes inside. And then I'll do the same thing again, right? So I'll have another message. Role is user. The content is this second example. Convert the following verbal description into a list of colors. Sage, nature, earth. Put my comma at the end. And then we have another message, this time the hypothetical response that we want back from the assistant, where the content is this right here. So it's just about reformatting things. And then finally, I can ask for the true prompt. Convert the following verbal description of a color palette into this list of colors. Role, or into a list of colors. User, content is this string here. Convert the following verbal description of a color palette into a list of colors. And then I need to make this an F string if I want to interpolate. Whoops, not that part. This part here. Interpolate the message that is being passed to this function. And I might as well rename this function. Let's call it the chat version. So get and render colors chat. That way I can keep the original, which is get and render colors. Okay, so now I've built up this list of messages, and I should be able to just pass that list of messages right on through when I make my completion. So instead of OpenAI.completion, it's now chatCompletion.create. There is no prompt field. It's called messages, and I'll set it equal to my messages list. The model, for the sake of price, will be GPT 3.5 Turbo. And sure, max tokens will still be 200. Then we'll have to deal with the response that we get back. Now remember, we get a different format back. So I'm going to comment this out for now, and let's just look at response. Let's print response. And it's unhappy about something. I must be missing a comma. There I am. Okay. So now let's try executing this function, get and render colors, the chat version, and I'll just provide the same prompt for Google brand colors. Okay, and we get a response. It looks like it's in the correct format, but remember, it's no longer located in response of choices 0 of text. It's now located in our response choices 0 message. And then within that message, we want the content property. We don't care that the role is assistant. So I'm going to get the content. And then I'll pass that through to JSON.loads like I did earlier. So that's parsing the JSON, this, to turn it into a list in Python. And then I can pass that through to my helper function that actually renders the little swatches for us. So let's try it again. I reran the function, and oh, I'm still printing this. Don't need that, but you can see my swatches showing up down there. So it works just as well as the original, which used the completion endpoint, but we're using this messages format for the chat API and saving 10 times more money, right? It's 10 times cheaper for the exact same prompt. Not to mention that 3.5 Turbo is a newer, more recently trained model than Text DaVinci 003, which is the best we can do here with the completion endpoint. And let's just do one or two more examples for fun. Let's do misty morning at the ocean. See if we get any nice colors. Well, that seems pretty good to me. Let's end with just one more. Let's try, I don't know, how about light blue sky with fresh green grass and what's another thing that might be there? And well, we can do white, but it's not going to be very exciting looking. Let's try that. Okay, so white is here. It's just blending into the background, and that works fine. And I lied. We'll do one more. What's another fun one? How about night sky with bright blue neon sign? And there we are, night sky color and blue neon. Okay, so as you can see, it works just as well, if not better, than the original that we did with the completion API, but it's 10 times cheaper and it's just a different format. You may or may not like the messages format. It's a little bit more involved, having to specify the role and the content. It's an extra layer, right, in the way, but it's worth it to get a better model and to have it be cheaper. So that's it. One more thing to know about the Chat API is that it supports almost all of the same parameters we saw with the completion API. So you'll remember things like, well, model and prompt, which prompt is not going to be supported with the Chat API because we provide messages instead. But then things like max tokens and temperature, top P, all stream, stop, presence penalty, frequency penalty are all supported by the Chat API. One exception is echo. If we go to the same page, so this is the Chat API documentation, we don't have echo as an option. Other than that, they're pretty much exactly the same. We still have N, top P, stream, stop, max tokens, presence, frequency penalty, temperature, all of that. We have model, but remember we use messages instead of prompt, and then we don't have the access to the echo capability, which all that echo did was spit the prompt back in addition to the output. So it gives you the prompt plus the output. The Chat API doesn't support that. Okay. So I'll just show one example of using let's play with maybe temperature. I'm just in this notebook where I had the Chat API basics. Let's do a chat completion.create with GPT 3.5 Turbo. And instead of doing this classifying stuff, let's do, I don't know, how about you are a helpful assistant that creates funny poems. And then we'll give it a prompt. So role is going to be user. Content will be generate me a 10-line poem, or let's just do a 5-line poem about the topic of your choosing. Okay? And then we will provide that, and we can play around with temperature, right? Let's set it to 1 to start, put a comma in there. Okay, and we get a response about pigs in the blanket. Oh, what a sight. Why don't we print the response nicely? Response equals, and then we'll print response of choices of 0, and I've got my brackets messed up. There we go. And then of that first one, we want the message. And then within that message, what we actually want is the content. Okay, here's our pizza poem. Now, if I increase this temperature way high, we're going to get some wonky results, as we know, which is fine. I just want to show you that temperature works, as do all the other things we learned, the penalties, max tokens. Oh dear, that is quite the poem that it's written me. Thank you for that temperature being so high. It makes absolutely no sense, but it's proof that temperature does work. And the other thing we should talk about is when we're working with the Chat API, if you look at max tokens right here, big difference. It has a different default. So it defaults to INF, which I believe is just infinite. Compare that to the completion API, max tokens. Where are you? Right here, defaults to 16. So we probably want to provide a limit, especially if I'm doing some crazy stuff with temperature where it's just generating me, hundreds of tokens or thousands of tokens possibly. So max tokens will be, 200. We'll run it again. And tokens with an S. And hopefully no surprise here. It's not going to give me, thousands of tokens. It's a much smaller output. Makes no sense. Traveling one destination at a time, pack your shades and put twists full of mime. Upon the stairway, make out some lassie kindness shrine. Well, it's kind of rhyming. I'll give it that. But because our temperature is so high, it makes no sense. So let's go back to maybe 0.9 or something. And we'll get a nice poem, hopefully. Pizza. You make my heart sing. Your cheese and toppings, a heavenly thing. From thin crust to deep dish, you never disappoint. A slice in my hand, my taste buds anoint. Pizza, my love for you, will never disjoint. All right, good enough. So some differences there around max tokens. Just the default value is different, but it works the same way. Your token usage is calculated the same way. It's the input tokens plus the output tokens billed at a whatever rate, depending on the model you're using. And then the main difference, we provide messages for chat completion. We provide prompt for regular completion. And then we don't have access to echo when we're working with the chat API. Welcome back. Next up, we're going to build a quick little project. It's going to be a chatbot built using GPT-4 and also using the chat API. So I'll run our chatbot. The simplest way to run it is just with no options, but it also accepts a personality that we can provide. I'll zoom in a tad. Okay, so it asked me to provide some text. It's color-coded with red for me and blue for the assistant. I'll say, I need some help writing an essay, or how about writing a bio about myself? And then it will respond back. Sure, I'd be happy to help you. Can you tell me a bit about yourself? What are your interests, accomplishments, all that stuff. My name is Colt Steele. I teach people how to code and create courses on Udemy. Let's see if that's enough. And it's just a basic interface, right, to talk about, not too bad. Expertise, create engaging, informative online courses to help people master essential programming skills. The only thing I'm not such a fan of is practicing yoga. I don't hate yoga. It's not really something I'd put in my bio. Okay, so I can quit by using Control-C. I can also provide a personality, though, like personality, rude, and obnoxious, just for fun. And I'll say, hi there, how is your day going? And it's going to respond, I don't have days, dummy. I'm just a chatbot trying to keep up. Okay, sorry. What are your thoughts on humans? Don't even get me started. You're so predictably fragile and clueless. I mean, you spend half your lives working at jobs you hate just so you can afford to buy pointless crap you don't need. Pathetic. So you can see the personality is working. And that's our project. So a simple chatbot, nothing revolutionary, but you could tweak it and give it a personality, to be a sort of customer service bot or just a command line based chat GPT client, essentially, just to get more practice working with the chat API and the messages list that we provide. Okay, so we'll get started in the next video. All right, so let's get to work on our basic chatbot. Again, nothing revolutionary, but we'll get practice with the chat completion endpoints. And the first thing that we'll do is make a file. So I'm going to do this as a command line utility. So I'll make a new file called chatbot.py or something. Okay, and then I'll open that up in VS Code. Okay, so here's my new file. And we'll start with some basic imports. I know we're going to want to use OpenAI. I also know that we're going to want to use .env or some way of getting the env file. So I think I'm just going to copy what we've already done. So from .env import .env values, and then remember we can call that .env values. Pass in, we'll just assume it's in a .env file for now. We could make a command line option where you provide the API key or a different path, but for now let's just do this. And we'll spruce it up a bit. We'll have some error handling if you don't provide a key, but let's just get a completion to work. So config equals .env values of env, and then I'm going to do config of OpenAI API key. That's what we're looking for, and I'm going to set OpenAI.API_key to be that. We've seen this many times, and then let's do a basic chat completion. So OpenAI.chat completion.create. And let's do a model. I'll do GPT-4 for now, although it's been pretty slow this morning. So I might change it to 3.5 Turbo. They'll both work equally well for what we care about just to get started. But I'll end with GPT-4. In case it's being slow, I'll make sure that we do get it to work with GPT-4 either way. And then messages for now, I'll just hard code a list in here. Super simple. How about I just pass a message where the role is user and the content is what is the best color on Earth? See what it says. Okay, and then let's print out whatever we get back. Let's print res. We'll just print the whole thing for now, and let's run it and make sure it works. So Python chatbot.py. Like I said, GPT-4 has been quite slow today. I think they just released or let a lot of people off the waitlist and into the beta. Okay, here we are. There is no objective answer to this question, as the perception of the best color depends on individual preferences. Everyone has their... Okay, great. Thanks for that non-answer. What is the best color on Earth according to different countries? I'm curious if there are different favorite colors around the globe. It has nothing to do with building a chatbot. So the next step here is going to be putting some sort of loop in place so that we can ask a user to enter some input, take that input, pass it off to the API, get the output back, print that out to the user, and then ask for more input and keep this loop going. Yeah, as you can see, it's really slow right now. So I'm going to switch over to 3.5 Turbo just while I'm writing this so that we don't have to wait so long. And then, of course, by the time you see this, probably it will be better. Okay, here we go. Interesting. Blue in many Western countries, the most popular. Green in Ireland. Saffron in India. Okay, so that gave me a better answer. Anyway, like I said, I'm going to go to 3.5 Turbo, which is also cheaper and not so slow right now. So what we're going to do is basically have a loop, a very simple loop that will look something like, I'll probably just do while true and then have a way to break out. So while true, we'll try doing something, and then I'm going to accept a keyboard interrupt. And that will happen when somebody hits Control C. So I'll accept that. If that's the case, I'll print out, I don't know, what should we print? Exiting. And then we'll break from our loop that otherwise runs forever. And then in our try, we're going to do an input, right? We're going to get the user's input. What do you say? U colon, and then a space. We'll take that. We'll call it like user input. And then we're going to pass that along to our OpenAI chat, right? So let's do it like this. We're going to need to tweak this, but we'll at least get it working with our loop in this video. So what I'm going to do is, instead of having content be what is the best color on Earth according to different countries, I'll just have it be our user input. So whatever the user says, once they hit enter, we'll take that, add it to the messages, and then we'll, next print it out after we get a response. So our response should be located, if you remember, inside of response, and then choices. And I'm just using n of 1. I don't want multiple answers. Of 0. And then we have the message. And then we'll print that out just to start. Okay? And then we'll ask the user again. Now, this is not really going to be much of a chat. I mean, it will, but there won't be any history. We won't be saving what has already been said and sending it back, right? It's just one message every time. But let's see if this part works. So I'm going to rerun this. While true, it's going to ask me to enter some text. So what animal is the fastest aquatic animal? Okay, so then I want to make sure I'm definitely printing out content, right? It says the common dolphin is the fastest aquatic animal, okay? What animal moves slowest? Great, three-toed sloth is considered the slowest animal, 0.15 miles per hour on the ground. But as I said, ignoring the fact that our output is ugly and we should only print the content, we're not actually sending any context through every time. There's no history. So it's just a one-off message each time. So if I try to do something like, help me write a bio about myself, it will respond eventually. Okay, and it's going to ask me to tell it my name and give it information, right? Begin with your name and your profession. So I'll say like, my name is Colt Steele and I teach people how to code. But it's not going to have that context. So it just says, wow, that's interesting. May I ask you what inspired you to become a coding teacher? So it's just these one-off messages. What we'll do next is build up all of our messages into a list of messages each time through and pass that to OpenAI so that it has the full context of a conversation. And that is something we'll do in the next video. Let's just make sure I can exit, by the way. If I type Control-C, there we go. It quits out. Okay, so we're going to keep working on our chatbot. The next very important part of making a chatbot is having the message history persist. Instead of just sending one message each time, I want to send all the messages that the user has sent and that the assistant has responded with, so we can actually have a conversation. To do this, I'll make a list of messages outside of my loop, otherwise I'm just redeclaring it every time. And I can start with an empty list. And then what I'll do is append the user's message into our messages list. And remember, each message has to follow a particular format where we have role set to user, system, or assistant. And this is going to be a user message. Each time the user types something in, we're going to have it be a user message. And we will pass through, what else? The content property will be set to whatever the user says. So this is the format of each message, and then what I'm going to do is append that to the messages list that will grow each time. And then I'll pass messages through here. And the first time through, right, it will only include a user's message. Actually, every time through, it will only include a user's message so far. So if I say, help me write my bio, that will be added as a message and sent through, and then it will respond back to me. And then next time the loop runs, I'll say something else and we'll append my new user message. So there'll be 2 user messages in there, and then that will be sent through. So what I'm going to do is print just the response text in here, which is the content property. And then I'll also print out the full list of messages. And right now we're only storing the user messages. So I'll say something like, what are you doing? And you can see my messages is a list that has my user message. And I'll do one more thing, like what color is grass? Okay. And now my user messages list has grown to include what are you doing and what color is grass. The next step is to include the responses that we get back from the assistant. So we'll take each response and add that into messages. And this is easy enough to do. We're already printing out right here what the assistant is responding with. We're printing out the content. What I want to do is take the whole message, and they all follow this format. Role is assistant, and then content is whatever the response is. So I'm going to take res of choice is 0 message, not the content, but the full message, and append that to messages. So messages dot append this res choices 0 message, and then I'll print out the content, and then I'll also print out all messages. It's going to be a lot of printouts, but let's just take a look at it. So I'll run my chatbot again. I'll keep the messages really brief. Hi there. Okay, and now take a look at the messages that we have. We have my first message, hi there, and then we have this. What's going on here? Well, it is the response that we got back. Content is hello, how can I assist you today? And the role is assistant. However, it is not a dictionary in Python. It is this OpenAI object. So there's just a really quick tweak. I need to turn it into a dictionary. So right here, where I'm appending it, I'll call toDict. And that should now make it a true dictionary. Let me clear here, run this again. Hi. and it responds with, how may I assist you today? Now our messages here has my message from the user and then the response from the assistant. So next time I send it through, I'll say something like, I need help writing a bio. And now, there's a lot to look at here because I'm printing so much, but now it's sent every message between me and the assistant every time I request the API. So it's happy to help me write a bio. I can tell it a bit about myself this time. My name is Colt, I guess I should capitalize that, Steele, and I teach people how to code. And this time, it will have the context from the previous message where I said, I need help writing a bio. And it's going to give me, hopefully, a nice bio here. Yeah, look at all that. Jeez. So it remembered I wanted to write a bio, and it took my message about my name and the fact that I teach people how to code, and it made this for me. Oh, interesting. This is actually sort of accurate. Hiking, playing guitar, sure. Maybe it was trained on a tiny bit of data, some Udemy web stuff involving my courses. Although this is all pretty generic. Anyway, and when I say it's remembering what we said, it's not remembering anything. We're just building up a list that we're passing through each time, this massive list here. So I'm no longer going to print that out. But you can see, right, starting here, hi from me, the user, hello from the assistant. I need help writing a bio from role of user, and then, sure, I'd be happy to help you. Can you tell me your name? From the assistant. We're building up this list of messages. All right, so let's not print out all messages. Let's just print out the response, and let's print out, what should we do here? Assistant, colon, and let's try it again. Let's get out of here, Control C. I need help. I need help naming my business. Sure, happy to help. What is your business about? What products or services do you offer? Let's say it's a restaurant in a ski town. Okay, let's see if it needs any more information. How about we serve locals mostly and focus on freshly baked pastries, good coffee, and pasta. I don't have a restaurant, to be clear. Let's see if it can help me name it. Here's some potential names. Powder Pastries, Alpine Eats, Snowy Summit Cafe. And then, because we have this history now that's persisting from one request to the next, I could say, can you try some more, what should we say, some edgier names, or names with a bit more humor? Carbs and caps, powdered dough, shred and spread. Well, that's not bad. Black Diamond Bakes, Slope Snacks Cafe. All right, so we got it working. And that's all there is to the actual chatbot logic. What we'll do in the next video is add the ability to prompt and provide a personality to the chatbot and some direction when we first fire it up. We'll provide a system message and we'll parse a command line argument. But that's kind of the basic approach. It's very simple to make a chatbot using the messages format when we're working with chat completion. Again, I'll try GPT-4 just to wrap this up, see if it's working any faster now. Okay, I'll say, what else would I use a chatbot for? Help me draft an email to a hiring manager. Yeah, it's going slow. Still slow. Come on. Well, it's been over 2 minutes. It's still going. Not the best chatbot. So I'll probably just wait until GPT-4 is back online or is less sluggish. There we go. Finally got a response. Anyway, we will continue to work on this in the next video. Okay, so as you saw at the end of the last video, GPT-4 has been very slow today, so I'm going to go back to 3.5 Turbo just to make our development process faster. The next thing I want to focus on is giving the user the ability to specify some sort of personality or an approach for the chatbot. Is it helpful? Is it rude? Is it sassy? Just some sort of system directive. And it might even be something more like you're a helpful chatbot, a customer service bot versus you're an essay writing bot versus you're a travel agent bot. It doesn't have to just be, rude or a toddler or something kind of fun. It could be a more useful directive. So what I'm going to do is have this set up as a command line argument. So we'll call Python chatbot.py and then maybe pass -p or -- personality, something like that. So if I did personality, I might provide something like you are a customer service bot or something, some sort of personality. So the first thing we'll do is just get it set up to expect a command line argument. And the easiest way to do that is by using a Python library called argparse. So I'll import that. It's nothing you have to install. It comes with Python, standard library. And the next thing I'll do is wrap all of my code, or almost all of the code, in a main function. So indent all of this, which we don't really have to do this, just best practice. And then our standard if _dunder name equals _main. If that's the case, we're going to execute the main function. All right, so nothing new there. That's just sort of standard Python boilerplate when writing a script. But what I am going to do is in my main function, check to see if there's arguments provided from the command line using argparse. And the first thing we do, if you've never used argparse before, we also use it in our Spotify project, our Spotify playlist generator. We execute argparse dot, and then argument parser, and then you're supposed to give it a description like simple command line chatbot with GPT-4 or something like that. And then the next step is to add arguments to the parser. So parser dot add argument, and then we come up with a name for the argument. So let's do -- personality. And then we specify the type. I'll say that it's a string, not in quotes, str. You can have integer arguments, Boolean strings. And then we give it a little piece of help if we want to, and this will be something like a tooltip, essentially, explaining what this argument does. A brief summary of the chatbot's personality. Okay? And then to actually get the arguments out, we call parser.parseArgs. So once we've told it, here's an argument to expect, then when we call parseArgs, it should return, if I save this to a variable, I'll print out args. It should show us the arguments that were provided. So if I execute this now and I pass personality and I set it equal to silly and goofy, for example. Whoops, why did I do touch? I did not mean touch. I meant to actually run my script with Python. We don't care about the chatbot. That's fine. It's going to start, but I'm ignoring that. Notice it says personality is equal to silly and goofy. Okay? So then what I can do is access on those args. I can access args.personality. And I can even provide a default value. So to provide a default, it looks like this. Default equals, and let's just say, what is our default? Friendly chatbot? Friendly and helpful chatbot? Let's say that's the default. Okay, so I'm just going to print out args.personality. When I pass a value in, it's set to silly and goofy. If I don't pass anything in, and I ignore that argument entirely, it should be set to friendly and helpful chatbot. So the next step is just passing that personality to OpenAI. And if you recall, when we learned about the messages syntax that we provide to the chat API, there are 3 different types of messages we can provide. We can provide role of user, role of assistant, and role of system. And we usually use the system message to set the initial context or to set the scene. So that's what I would do here. I would add some sort of system message where at the beginning, messages, instead of starting empty, we'll have a role of system message. And that message will say something in the content, including the personality. So what I think I'll do is start with a variable. We'll call it prompt or something, maybe initial prompt. And it's going to start by saying, you are a conversational chatbot, just to explain you're a chatbot. And then it will say your personality is, and then in here, I want to put in what the personality is supposed to be. So there's a couple of options for how we do this, but the simplest one is just to rely on our default value that we set up, friendly and helpful chatbot. So I think I'll just go to friendly and helpful. Your personality is, and then I'll add that in. And the way that I access that is args.personality, right? That will hold the argument called personality, whether it was actually passed or if we're relying on the default of friendly and helpful. So all that I'll do is make this an F string. Your personality is, and then I'll put in args.personality right there. And then finally, I'll pass the content of our initial message to be the initial prompt. So you are a conversational chatbot, your personality is friendly and helpful. Or if I pass something in, your personality is rude and sarcastic. Let's see if it works. So that's our initial message. Let's try running this. And I'll set personality to be rude, how about, and sarcastic. What should I eat for dinner? Let's see if it's rude and sarcastic. I don't know. Maybe try using your brain for once and make your own decision. Or, oh my goodness, or just order fast food like the lazy slob you probably are. Okay, and let's not provide anything this time and just rely on the default, and it should be friendly and helpful this time. What should I eat for dinner? I hope it's nicer. There are many options for dinner, depending blah, 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 blah. Do you have any dietary preferences or food allergies that I should keep in mind? I'm not vegan, but I'll say I'm a vegan. I have a vegan friend staying with me, so I'm eating vegan. It's a challenge. There are a lot of delicious vegan options. Okay, so it's being friendly and helpful, right? Let's try one more. Let's do another super obvious personality. Your personality is childish and toddler-like. 3 years old. What should I eat for dinner? I love food. Maybe some yummy macaroni and cheese or pizza would be delicious. Okay, it's talking a bit at a higher level than a 3-year-old. Like, I don't know what 3-year-old wants something healthy like a salad, but still you can tell it's impacting. I mean, it's saying yummy macaroni. Ooh, I love food. Pizza. Good enough for us. We're not really building the next professional, enterprise chatbot here. Anyway, that's pretty much it for getting the personality passed in. Just remember, we provide this system message at the beginning, although it doesn't have to be a system message. In fact, the docs for certain models of GPT 3.4, at least, the system message is sometimes not treated with enough reverence. So you can also pass it as a user message. But it seems to be working as a system message. And that's the direction OpenAI wants us to go in the future. Always pass a system message with some sort of overall directions, and then pass your user and assistant messages if necessary. Welcome back. The final slight change we'll make has to do with colorizing the output to make it easier to distinguish the user input/output versus what the assistant is saying. Let's see what happens if I just type gibberish. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. As you can see, it's not impossible to distinguish, but it is harder to tell if I had a whole bunch of text here, what's coming from me and the assistant, and to differentiate them. So instead, poor thing, I'm still not able to understand what you're trying to communicate. How about blah? So you can understand that. It doesn't know how to respond to blah. Anyway, so what we'll do is add some simple bolding to each name of whoever's talking, and then also colorize the assistant to be, let's say, red or blue, and then you to be the other color, red or blue. So to write colorizing logic, it's not very difficult. There's also libraries that help you colorize your output, but I've gone ahead and written 3 functions. I just pasted them in here. Very simple. One is called bold, one is called blue, and one is called red. And what this will do is it takes some text in, and it will wrap the text with the special characters that we use to generate bold text or blue text or red text. And it's kind of annoying what these codes look like. You just Google them. But for example, this is how you make text red. I'll just show you. If I did a print and I copy this right there, and then some text like hello, and then I put the ending sequence after it, this should print hello at the beginning in red, as you can see. Okay, so all that I'm going to do is use these functions, bold, blue, and red, when I'm outputting text. So we have right here where we're asking a user to enter their text. It says you. What I'm going to do is wrap that in, should the user be blue? Sure. We'll wrap you in blue. Start it up again, and you can see you is printed out in blue. Hello. And then assistant is still in black. So where we're printing out the assistant right here, I'm going to call our red function. And now we have some color differentiation, hopefully. Hello there. And then we get assistant in red. But I also want to bold it, so I'll just double wrap that in bold, just like that. And that should make the assistant text bold and red. Hello. There we are. You can see it's bolded and red. And I'll do the same thing where we print out you. We're asking for the input. I'm going to add in bold and wrap that around blue. Like I said, there's libraries that will do this, but since we're not really doing much, it's pretty simple just to write those functions. Hello there. It's blue and bold, and then the assistant is red and bold. It's easier just to see what's happening. I need help breaking up with my girlfriend. Let's see what it says. Is it going to be helpful? Breaking up with someone can be tough, but okay, yeah, seems helpful. Be clear and direct, choose an appropriate time. It's never easy, but it's better to end things sooner rather than later if it's not working out. Thank you for the nice advice. Okay, so that's pretty much all that there is to this. Our chatbot's pretty much done at this point. What we could add in, if we want to get fancy, add in an argument to allow somebody to provide a specific environment variable file. That's what I did in the original version. This is my original chatbot that I wrote. So it asks you, or you can provide an env file variable. It defaults to .env, but you can provide something else if you wanted to. And then I just check to see if you provided that key. If it found the key, then it doesn't raise an error. If it doesn't find the key, it raises an error. So, we could add that logic in. It's probably a waste of your time though. When we do the Spotify project, it's more important because we will be making playlists using the Spotify client, and you have to have a Spotify API key and a Spotify secret. Otherwise, the whole script breaks. So I'll show that approach when we get there. I think it's best to keep this simple. Just a single argument, which is personality. And if you don't provide it, it defaults to friendly and helpful. We've got some colorized output, but the bulk of this, and there's not much to it, but the bulk is just making sure that we have the messages logic set up correctly so that we're passing the previous context through every single request. We're growing our list of messages with the user role and then the corresponding assistant response, and growing that list of messages and passing it through to OpenAI each turn. And that's how you build a simple chatbot. Welcome back. In this section, I want to show some examples of how we can use GPT 3.5 Turbo and GPT-4 to work with code-related queries. So when I say code-related queries, I mean things like explain this code to me, or translate this code from Python to JavaScript, or complete this code, or fix this code, or debug this code, or just write a function, write some code for me. There used to be a standalone model. It still exists, called Codex. However, it was deprecated in about a month ago, as of recording this, March 2023. So I did have some materials I prepared for that, and then it was deprecated. But fear not, the examples that I had prepared work just as well using the new chat models, which is exactly what they say here. The Codex models are now deprecated. Please check out our newer chat models, 3.5 Turbo and GPT-4, which are able to do many coding tasks with similar capability. So if you ever see a model that's prefixed with code, like code-DaVinci, that was a Codex model. So it still works, although they're encouraging us not to use it anymore. The good news is that the chat endpoint works great. You just have to sort of finagle your messages into the correct format. So in this video, we'll start with a simple example. Let's use GPT-4 to explain a Python function. So I have OpenAI already imported. I don't have to do anything fancy to work with code. Just like any other set of messages, I just have to set up the messages and decide what these messages will include. So I'm thinking my first message will be something, our system message, and it will, that's supposed to be role. Whoops, role is system. And then I'll just say you are a code explaining assistant or something. You are a Python explaining assistant. Okay, and then I'll have my next message, and I have a function that I've already written here, remove common prefix, that let's just say we don't understand what it does. I know what it does, but if you look at it, you may not know what it does. So I'm going to ask OpenAI, I'm going to ask GPT-4 to explain it to me. So I'm going to put it in a, how should I do this? I guess I'll just put it in a triple quoted string. We'll call this func. And then I'll just paste it right in there. Okay. And then I can ask it, if I say role is user, to, let's do an F string, explain the following function. And then I'll simply insert my function right there, which is called func. So it's just like any other text. I'll provide the text and then put it in a messages list. And then down here, I guess I'll do this, our openai.chat completion.create. And we'll set messages to be messages, and we'll set model to be GPT-4. And let's save this to a variable, res, and let's see what happens when I run it. We'll wait for that to finish, and then we'll look at res. Come on, GPT-4. I'm constantly torn in recording of this course between going with GPT-4, which is the newest model, obviously, and the one most people care about, but it's also been very slow, at least in this beta period, compared to GPT 3.5 Turbo, which is almost as good for something like this. We probably won't notice a difference, but it's way faster. Their API is probably just under less of a heavy load compared to the GPT-4 endpoints. Now it finally finished, but that was 10, 15 seconds of me having to fill dead air there. Now let's print this out. So it's res, choices, and then we want the first choice, and within that we want the message, and then within that we want content. And we'll print that. And here's the explanation I get. The function remove common prefix takes 3 arguments: x, a data frame or dictionary-like data structure containing a key, completion, whose value, I don't want to read this whole thing out in front of you, to be honest, but this is accurate. It is supposed to be a data frame, a prefix, WS prefix, indicating whether or not the white space should be kept as a prefix. This is all accurate if you look at the original function. We use WF prefix. It's a Boolean. If that exists, WS prefix rather, then we'll keep the single white space. And then if we scroll down, it explains the arguments, but then it also explains what the function actually does. basically it takes a data frame and a prefix. It removes that common prefix from a column in the data frame. It doesn't really matter if you know what data frames are or if that function makes sense to you, but the explanation is accurate. So we could try it with another function, or you could even get way more specific about the output that you want. Maybe I just want a paragraph. This is a lot. Maybe I want something shorter. There's a lot of stuff that I could do with my prompt, but as you can see, it understands code, right? It was trained on code, so it's able to respond with decent explanations. You'll also see that often it's not perfect, and the inaccuracies are more glaring when we're talking about code than when we're talking about language and, English, for example, where there's a bit more nuance. With code, something either works or doesn't work. So if we ask it to write a function, I'd say in my experience, 80% of the time it works well, 20% of the time it just completely fails and the functions break and don't work. So we'll talk about that when we see examples of asking it to write code. Because at the moment, I just asked it to explain code and it worked. Next up, I want to show another example. I'm going to do a couple of examples in the next few videos on working with code-related queries and questions with GPT-4. And the one I'll show in this video has to do with calculating time complexity of algorithms. Now, if you're not familiar with calculating time complexity or the concept of big O notation, then this probably won't mean a lot to you. And it's not a big deal at all. It's just one demo. But this is a task that it's not really a task, but this is something that is important to do when you're writing algorithms, and especially when people are focusing on interviewing and getting hired and working on data structures and sorting algorithms and all sorts of fun. I'm doing air quotes around fun because most people don't like this stuff, but it's a very important part of, at the very least, getting a job, let alone working on that job. Time complexity will still come up in the real world. Anyway, a lot of people don't like calculating it, or they have a hard time figuring out if something is O of n squared or of O of n log n, for example. Again, if that doesn't mean anything to you, just skip the video. But we can use the chat API in GPT 3.5 or GPT-4 to figure out the time complexity of algorithms. And I've been pretty impressed with it. I tested it with probably 15 different examples. I'm not going to make you watch 15. And it got all of them right. However, it's unclear to me still how much work it is doing to truly understand the code versus recognizing common algorithms and patterns. So it does well as far as I can tell, but again, there's no guarantee that it's going to be accurate. And when it's wrong, it is definitely wrong, especially when it comes to code, as I talked about in the previous video. It's harsher, the difference between right and wrong when it comes to programming compared to writing a poem. If it's wrong, it might sound funny or might not rhyme, but if it's a piece of code, it just won't work. Anyway, what I have here are two functions that I've written. One is an implementation of bubble sorts. Now, I normally would name this like bubble sort, but I got rid of that because I didn't want to give it any indications as to the fact that this is bubble sort, a very common beginner sorting algorithm. So the variable is named bubble sort. And then I have an implementation of quick sort down here. And I renamed the function. Instead of saying quick sort, it just says sort. Again, to prevent the model from picking up on the function name and just easily identifying what the code does, because it's seen this function a million times before. Now, it still tends to recognize that this is bubble sort and this is quick sort. So just so you know, quick sort is worst case O of n squared time complexity, average is O of n log n, and bubble sorts is O of n squared time complexity. So all I have to do, if I want to ask, let's delete this cell and do it down here. If I want to ask GPT-4 to calculate the time complexity of either of these functions, is write some sort of message. Honestly, I don't even think it's worth doing a system message. We can get away with just a single message that looks something like, role is user. You could do a system message that says, you are a time complexity calculating assistant, but I found it works pretty much exactly the same. I didn't notice a difference. If I just asked it straight up to calculate the time complexity of the following function. Now, I could pass both at once and specify how I wanted it to, provide me the results, but I'm just going to do one at a time. So calculate the time complexity for the following function, and then I'll provide my function. So I'll do an f string here. And let's start with my variable called bubble sort. Okay, so that's my messages. By the way, I'm working in a new notebook. I didn't point that out, but it's a new notebook. It's going to be a short one. Okay, so we'll do our OpenAI.chat completion.create, and then provide our messages, which is just one message in a list. And I'll do GPT-4, although 3.5 Turbo works fine for this too. Save that to a variable, and let's print out res. And let's see if it feels like going a little faster than it did in the previous video. It's a little better. Okay, so I should filter it out and get down to the content, but we can see right here, time complexity of this function is O of n squared, where n is the length of the input array. That's correct. This is because there are two nested loops, each iterating through the array in a linear manner, making the overall time complexity quadratic. Exactly right. Couldn't have said it better myself. So it got that one right, and it didn't recognize it as bubble sort as far as I can tell. It didn't say this is an implementation of bubble sort. Now it would do that, I've found, if I put bubble sort anywhere in here, or if a comment mentions bubble sort, which I think it's more honest to not put that name in there, because then it's actually calculating, or it's trying to calculate the time complexity, as far as I can tell, right? We don't really have any insight into what it's truly doing. It might have just seen this exact code before and it's able to spit out O of n squared, or maybe it's reasoning through it. Okay, so let's just do res of choice is 0, just because I'm going to run this again with our quick sort. Message and content. And now I'm just going to swap this out to use the quicksort function, or the quicksort variable, which is actually two functions here, sort, and then it calls partition. All right, let's try that one. So I'll rerun. Oh, what's it unhappy about? Quicksort. There we go. And now I'll run this again, and let's see what it says. And we wait. Come on. Yeah, okay. So it did recognize this one as quicksort. And then at that point, I mean, it can just probably, it's seen time complexity of quicksort written everywhere on the internet. Any sort of programming, developer training, interview prep book, they all are going to talk about quicksort and the time complexity. Worst case is O of n squared quadratic time, as we mentioned. Average case, O of n log n. So just another example of the fact that GPT 3.5 Turbo and GPT-4 can recognize or understand, they can work with code. And I'm doing Python here, but in the next video, I'll show you JavaScript as an example. We're going to translate JavaScript to Python or vice versa. And it doesn't have any trouble with that either. So that's coming up. Next, we have another example of using GPT, in this case GPT-4, to work with code. I'm going to ask it to translate some JavaScript functions into Python. We could also go the other way around, but what's nice, if I do it from JavaScript to Python, I can immediately just test the Python functions in the same notebook, and we can see if they work, instead of having to fire up a bunch of JavaScript and HTML to get them to run. So I have a new notebook. I've done the standard importing of OpenAI. I've set my API key, and then I have a function here that I've called mystery. And the reason I'm doing this is just I don't want the name to give GPT-4 any clues. Normally, so this is a function that finds the minimum value in a JavaScript array, which, by the way, there are many other ways of doing this in JavaScript that don't involve using reduce. But I wanted to find a slightly more complex, maybe obfuscated option. Which is what this is. So instead of calling it min, which is what it should be called, I'm not going to say min and not give GPT-4 any hints as to what it does. And I'm hoping that it will return to me a Python function when I execute it that will take an array or a list of values in Python and give me the minimum value. So I'm going to follow the same sort of template that I did in the past few videos. I don't think, honestly, it's worth even providing a system message because it's pretty straightforward, our request. So I'm just going to say role is user. I could definitely start by saying you are a code translating assistant that translates from JavaScript to Python. But I can also just do it like this. I'll make an F string where the content in here is translate, let me zoom out, the following JavaScript to Python. And then I will insert my JS variable that is holding this function right there. Okay, so that's my messages. I'm going to pass that to a chatCompletion.create and print out whatever our result is. Okay, so it gives me this function called mystery. And I can tell, hopefully you can see it's correct. It's going to give me the minimum value in whatever this list, it's called ARR because it's the same parameter name, even though in Python we call those lists, not arrays. But I would probably want to rename that instead of mystery, but we can always verify that it works. It's a pretty straightforward function because it's just calling the built-in min function. But let's provide some numbers in here, -3, and it should return the minimum of -3. Okay, so that worked. Let's try another example. So on my clipboard, I have another function. I'm just going to put it in another variable, a triple quoted string. And this function is a validate email function. So once again, I'm going to call this mystery. And I'm using arrow function syntax, just changing up the syntax, slightly more modern JavaScript. And it takes an email as a string, and it returns to us whether it's a valid email or not. Now, I didn't write this regular expression. I haven't actually tested it, but I assume it works. But let's see what happens when I pass this to openai.chatcompletion.create. And we get back. Okay, so this is slightly more complicated, right? It's having to import the RE standard library, regular expression. You probably would not do that in the function itself. But other than that, let's see if this works. So I'm going to put that up top, run this function. Let's call our mystery function with an email like todd@gmail.com, and it should return true, and it does. Now let's do something incorrect. False, right? What about t@dasd? That's also false. So I'm not really testing much here, right? It's not validating real emails or anything. It's just following, checking to see if they match a pattern. But it seems to have translated it pretty successfully. All right, next I've got one more function on my clipboard. This one will capitalize the first letter of every word in a string. So it splits it in JavaScript. It takes a string and it splits every character on a it splits every word separated by a space. It lowercases everything in there. And then it uppercases the first letter of each one of those words and then stitches them back together into a single string. So I'm again going to call this mystery. There's no comments or hints in here as to what it does, which if we were trying to help GPT-4 out, we definitely want to put comments in there, and you can steer it if it is getting confused. You can put a comment in there that explains what this does. But so far, it's been working great for me without having to do that, although these are pretty simple functions. Let's see what we get here. Okay. So this one's pretty straightforward. Didn't have to do a whole lot of, it translated things, but for the most part, it's sort of a one-to-one replica. Let's see what happens if I pass it, I like to eat chicken. And there we are. It capitalizes the first letter of every letter in this, of every word in this string. So just some simple examples, but it illustrates once again that GPT-4 has no problem working with code. Although these are pretty simple functions, it tends to do well with these standalone functions. It definitely has a harder time if you tried to pass it a whole file of code that has tons of dependencies, or not to mention, JavaScript specific APIs. It will try and make it work in Python. It will even include libraries or try to include libraries if needed, but it's not always perfect. So even though I showed you 3 examples where it was pretty much perfect, just keep that in mind. It won't work miracles. It gets close, but it's not perfect. Next, another example of using GPT-4 to help us with some sort of code-related task. In this case, we can ask it to help us find, fix, or even explain bugs. So I have some simple functions I'm going to use here. Again, it works very well with simpler stuff. I found the more complicated your code gets, unsurprisingly, the less reliable the results are. It's still pretty impressive. So I have a function here called add underscores. It is not working. It's supposed to. I'll just run it for you so you can see. I guess I'll do it right here. It's supposed to add underscores after every letter in a word. So hello should become H underscore E underscore L underscore in the result that we get printed out. Instead, we just get O underscore. So it's not working. Now, you may be able to identify the bug already. It's nothing terribly complicated, but I'm going to ask GPT-4 to do it for me. So all that I'll do is in the content here of the message, I'll just do a single message. I'll say something like fix, and let's have it explain as well. Fix and explain the bug in the following Python code. And I put it in a variable called code, and I'll just put it right here, code. Okay, so let's run that completion. There we go. So it says the bug in the code is that it doesn't build up the new word properly with underscores between the characters. Instead, it only adds an underscore to the last character of the input word. That's exactly what happened. To fix this, we need to update new word by appending the current character and an underscore in each iteration. If you look at what's happening here, new word starts as an underscore, and then we're just resetting new word every time instead of growing new word and appending to it or adding on. So that's what this does right here, right? It's plus equaling, and that should solve it for us. We can verify. It gives us very helpful. By putting the explain in there, it really helps to understand what went wrong. Okay, so that's one example. Next up, we have some very bad code that has more than one thing wrong with it. So I can try running it, but it's not going to run. There are issues here. What it's supposed to do is basically pick some random integers, right? So whole numbers, and then give us a little quiz. 10 times it's supposed to give us a quiz where it asks us what is the first number times the second number. And then we answer, let's say, we say it's 5, and it's going to check if we're correct or not. Now you can probably see some of these bugs already. I mean, there's no quotes around the string. That's a simple one. Random is with an uppercase R that doesn't exist. So if I run this, it's just not going to work. But it's supposed to keep asking me sort of like a game, a very bad game, where it generates a random number, 1 to 12, and then another one, 1 through 12, and then it asks me what their product is, and it checks my work. So there's invalid syntax, and it's not working. So if I ask GPT-4 to do the same thing, so I'll put in a code variable, just fix and explain the bugs. Maybe I'll put parentheses around that, so bugs in the following Python code. It may take a little while. And there we go. So it did take a while, 20 seconds or so. And it says there are several issues in the code. So it gives me a fixed version, right? What it says is working. And it adds comments as well to explain what's happening at every step of the way. And it also gives me a list of the issues. So incorrect import statement. These two kind of seem like the same thing to me. Incorrect import statement for the random module. Inconsistent capitalization of the random module. So it doesn't actually do a great job of telling me you just need to lowercase the R in random. But that's what it did, right? You can see it has a lowercase r compared to the input that had an uppercase R. That module doesn't exist. Next, it suggests that the A and B values need to be regenerated for each iteration in the loop, which technically is not true. But if it was supposed to give me, a new math problem every time through the loop, then yes, it should regenerate them. Otherwise, it's giving me 10 guesses for the exact same two numbers. They won't be regenerated. So let's say this is 3 and this is 5. It's going to keep asking me, what is 3 times 5? What is 3 times 5? What is 3 times 5? So GPT-4 assumes that we want to make a new problem every time through with new numbers. Additionally, the A and B values are not converted into strings. If you look at what's happening here, the A and B values, which are numbers, are being concatenated with the string using plus signs, and that will not work. We'll get an error. You can't add a string to a number. So they need to be turned into strings. So its suggestion here is to cast them to a string. Honestly, I would just use an F string and interpolate them. It's way cleaner than having to do all these plus signs, but this should work. This is an important one. If you look at the if statement here, I'm using a single equal sign, which is for assignment, right? Assigning a variable, not for comparison. So that needs to be a double equal sign, and that's what it says right here. And then also missing quotes around well done, which it's missing, right? Not going to be valid at all. So let's take its suggested version and try running this. We'll keep the comments in there. Okay. And now it starts the little game. 8 times 1, let's get it wrong. No. 3 times 4, let's get it right. And it's working, right? Simple enough. Still very basic code, but it's finding more than one issue, quite a few issues, and explaining them. And there's many ways you could actually incorporate this in the real world. In the next video, we're going to see a little project, a code reviewer project that's more in depth. But even this simple example illustrates that it's pretty good when you're dealing with simple issues in your code. We're about to take a look at another project involving code, but I actually want to show one more example, which is asking GPT-4 to write functions for us from scratch. So not just fixing bugs or explaining existing functions or translating a function or something like that, but asking it to write code from scratch, which I've had decent luck with in a lot of situations. But like everything with GPT-4, especially with code, the more complicated it gets, the code gets, the worse it performs. But if you view this as more of a starting point and a place to get inspiration, or to get 90% of the work done, and you may need to tweak things, it can work very well. So here's a real example that I needed a couple days ago. I needed a Python function to convert an RGB color to an HSL color. So I could easily just write something in a message like, write a Python function that accepts an RGB color and returns the corresponding HSL color. And if this doesn't work, or if I'm not happy with the results, of course I could give it some examples, right? We talked about 0 and few shot learning, where I could give it, or few shot prompting rather than not learning, where I could give it an example or two to show the output that I want, given an input. But let's just see if this works, because often it works pretty well with the 0 examples. Okay, that finished up. It took a little while. And you can see that it gave me a function here. It's a long one. And that's kind of why I was having a rough time writing the conversion myself. And the way that it set it up is that, by the way, it gives me an explanation and an example usage, but it set it up to expect the R and G and B colors, the different channels, to be passed individually, which is fine. I didn't tell it exactly what shape I wanted it to be in as far as that parameter, but let's test it out. So RGB to HSL. RGB to HSL, and then I have to provide the 3 different colors. And I'm going to go to a color picker. Let's say I like this color green, sure. And that is 85, 145, 0 in RGB. So 85, 145, and 0. And this is what it returns back to me. So 84.83, 100, and 28.43. And according to Google here, just with the color picker, that's correct. Now it just rounds up here, which is fine. But 85, 100, 28. So if we round up, right, 85, 100, and 28, it looks like it's working. But maybe I want to change it. The situation I was in was I needed to have a CSS RGB color in this format that I passed in. So it would look like this. RGB equals, and then it's an actual RGB color code in CSS, a comma separated list, right, inside of parentheses with RGB. And then the return value that I want is also a CSS friendly value. So if you're not familiar with CSS, this is what it looks like when you write an HSL color. You have a couple of different options, but usually this is what I use. So this is the degrees, and then these are both percentages. You optionally can also write degrees. So if this is the format that I want it to spit out the CSS friendly string for me in HSL format, given an RGB CSS formatted string. I need to tell GPT-4 that that's what I want. So this is where an example might come in handy, or at the very least, some more specifics. So if I go back to my messages here, I'll say write a Python function that accepts an RGB color in the format, and then I'll put quotes like that, and returns a corresponding HSL color in the format. And then I'll grab my HSL color, and it just so happens that these two, well, these actually don't match. I probably it would be a good idea to put the correct values here, right? So that they do match, and it also acts as an example. So let me go back to the color picker. It's 85, 100%, 28%. So this acts both as an example of the formatting that I want, but it's also an example in the prompt of an input and an output. I didn't really tell it that these are supposed to match, but let's just see if this works. Getting more specific with the formatting will probably take a little while. It did last time, so I'll be back when it finishes. Okay, it finished up, and you can tell, we don't know if it works yet, but it's expecting an RGB string, and let's see what it returns at the end. It returns, yep, an F string that looks like it matches our pattern. So let's try it. Let's put this one down here. RGB to HS, I guess I'll call it HSL2 just so we have a record of both. And then let me copy my RGB string and call the function RGB to HSL2. And I'll pass in that full string. And there we are. I get 84, 100%, and 28%. And it looks like it worked just fine, right? So this is the same color as far as CSS is concerned as this right here. So another example of prompting where providing examples, providing the inputs and the outputs that you want really make a difference. And honestly, this is one of the areas I've found GPT-4 to be the most useful, is just to help me get some quick stuff done, right? It's not going to write an application for you, at least not yet, but it can easily write useful functions that might take some time and Googling for me to figure out. And next up, we're going to move on to a code-based project. Welcome back. Next up, we're going to talk about a library called TickToken. It's put out by OpenAI, and it's a tokenizer library. It basically has one goal. We give it a piece of text, and it will return to us the tokens that would be generated by that piece of text specific to different encodings. So basically, we'll say, all right, we have this big piece of text for GPT-4. How many tokens are in it? And with a little bit of work, it will tell us this will be 500 tokens or 10,000 tokens. And then we can make decisions based off of that. We can do things like figure out rough pricing estimates, but also there are many queries we could write where we really have to know how close we are to hitting the max token limit. And the reason I'm bringing this up now is in our next project, we are going to summarize entire books. Let me find an example. A book like this. This is Peter Pan. We do it with The Great Gatsby and Peter Pan and Metamorphosis. These are books that are way, way too big to fit into a single prompt. So we have to write some code that basically takes the correct number of tokens out of this book and passes them through in a single request, and then does that like 50, 100, or 1,000 times, and then takes each individual summary and stitches them back together and does that process over and over recursively. But the key to being able to determine how much this text to include at once is knowing how many tokens are in each piece of text. So that is where this library comes in called TickToken. It's put out by OpenAI. You can see it's on their GitHub organization. It's called TickToken, and it's pretty simple to use. You need to install it. So that's just a pip install TickToken. I've already done this. If you've installed TickToken in the past, you may want to upgrade it because GPT-4 has since come out. And GPT-4 actually uses the same encoding as GPT 3.5 Turbo, but still, if you installed this a while ago, you probably want to upgrade it. And then once I have that, I will import it. Import TickToken. All right, so the next thing you have to understand is that there are different encodings, different algorithms used to take text and split it into tokens. There's three main ones. They have names that I can never remember: CL100K base, P50K base, and R50K base. And depending on the model that you're using, that changes which encoding algorithm is used. So for GPT-4 3.5 Turbo, it's CL100K base. When we're talking about Text DaVinci 003, it's P50K base. So you have to know which encoding is used. So let's start with P50K base. Let's say I'm trying to figure out with Text DaVinci 3, how many tokens are in a paragraph of text. The first step, once I've imported tick token, is then to get the correct encoding using the get encoding method. So I'll do that here, tick token.get encoding, and then I pass through the name of an encoding. And this will go and find the encoding with that name. Okay, and then all that I do is call encoding.encode. If I called this variable enc.encode, and then I pass a piece of text like hello world. And what this will return to me is a list of token IDs. So you can see there's 3 numbers in here. This means this piece of text was turned into 3 tokens. And if I copy this exactly, and I go to the tokenizer on OpenAI, we saw this early on, it shows me 3 tokens. And down here, I can toggle between the text and then the token IDs, and we see the same token IDs, right? 15496, 995, and 0. 15496, 995, and 0. So it does the same thing. The tokenizer in the browser is limited in that it only supports GPT-3, so that's a big limitation. But more importantly, we have to copy and paste our text into here manually, and that would not work. If I was trying to write code to summarize this entire book programmatically, I need some way of knowing how many tokens are in this piece of text. I need to grab, let's say, 4,000 tokens at once. I could write a function to do that using tick token, where I ask tick token, how many tokens are here? And I keep adding on until I get to 4,000, and then I stop. But the tokenizer does the same thing. It's the same algorithm behind the scenes. It's just a browser tool, and it's a good teaching demonstration. But tick token is what you would use in the real world to actually figure out how many tokens are in a piece of text. So the actual way to figure out the number of tokens would be to wrap it in len, right? Find the length of that list, and we see there's 3 tokens. So if I have something else, like maybe a paragraph or 2 of text, I'll take, I don't know, some paragraphs of text from this book. It really doesn't matter where, but maybe all of this content. I'll put this in a variable. I'll call this like book text. I'll make it a triple quoted string. I'll put that in there. All right. I'll save that, or I'll run that cell. And then I can figure out how many tokens are in there by rerunning this line. And I'll provide my book text variable. And it tells me that's 253 tokens. Now, it's important to note that if I change my encoding to be something else, like the GPT 3.5 encoding, which is CL100K base, I may get a different number of tokens because it's a different encoding. So it does matter, which algorithm we're using here. So we got 253. Now we get 224 tokens when we use this encoding, CL100K base, which is what GPT 3.5 Turbo and GPT-4 both use. Now, if you struggle, like me, to remember the names of these encodings, there's also a helper function called encoding for model. And this will go and get the corresponding encoding. So I actually prefer to use this. I'll keep this here, but I'll comment it out. And I'll use the get encoding, well, it's just called encoding for model. You provide the model name, and then it gets the corresponding encoding, and we should get the same number, 224. So here's a function that we could write just to wrap up, the functionality that we just saw. It's a function called num tokens from string. You provide it a piece of text and then a model name. And all that it does is it returns the number of tokens in that piece of text by first getting the corresponding encoding using the model name with this encoding for model method I just showed you. And then once we have that encoding, we turn that piece of text into a list of tokens, and then we get the length of that list of tokens and return it. So I should just get the same result if I do num tokens from string, and then I provide my book text, and then GPT 3.5 Turbo, we get 224. If I do the same thing with a different model, like Text DaVinci 003, it's 253 tokens. So this is a nice helper function that we could use to figure out how many tokens are in a piece of text given a model. And that's it for this video. And if you wanted to figure out pricing, by the way, right, you just figure out, okay, what's this GPT 3.5 Turbo cost? Somewhere on here. Yeah, 3.5 Turbo on their pricing page right now is $0.002 per 1,000 tokens. So, you could take this, go to our notebook, call this price per token, and then divide that by 1,000, right? And then we could multiply this times the price per token, and it would tell us. And then we can see that it's $0.0005 for this number of tokens for Text DaVinci 3.5 Turbo. Although this was actually using Text DaVinci 3, so that's not accurate. The price for Text DaVinci 3 is different. This price per token that I have is for GPT 3.5 Turbo. And I'm sure pricing information will change. Okay, there we go. It's $0.0004 for 224 tokens with GPT 3.5 Turbo. Okay, next we'll talk about some of the lengths we have to go to when it comes to estimating tokens for the messages syntax for the chat APIs, and that's coming up. Welcome back. So in the previous video, we saw how we can figure out the number of tokens in a piece of text, depending on the model. However, if we're working with the chat API, which if we're talking about 3.5 Turbo or GPT-4, they currently only work with the chat API. The way that we pass our messages is using the messages syntax, right? Where we have, if I make some more cells here, a role for each message. It looks something like this, right? Role is user, and then we have content. This should be review, hopefully, is set to something. So unfortunately, the way that we're billed is not just on this number of tokens. It's actually a little bit harder to calculate, where each message is billed as a set number of tokens, plus this will be turned into a number of tokens, and this will be counted as a number of tokens, and then all of that is summed together. Fortunately, OpenAI has put out a notebook that explains how to count tokens for chat API calls, and they've written a function that we can just steal. And this function is simple enough to work through. It's called number of tokens from messages. We provide a list of messages and then a model, which defaults to 3.5 Turbo. And it goes and gets the corresponding encoding. It tries to get it. And then there's some handling. If it can't find that model, it will use the CL100K base encoding. And it checks to see if your model is a GPT 3.5 Turbo model. Every message gets a set number of tokens, which is 4. So every message, no matter the content, will be a minimum of 4 tokens. If we're using GPT-4, every message has a set minimum of 3 tokens, and then any content is added onto that. So if we take their example list of messages right here, I'll just copy this and put it down here. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 messages. So if we're using GPT-4, this message is billed to start as 3 tokens. And this is 3 tokens, and then this is 3 tokens, and then the actual message values are going to be tokenized and counted as well. But at a minimum, each message, no matter what, is 3 tokens as a base fee when we're talking about GPT-4. With 3.5 Turbo, it's 4 tokens. So this may change. I have no idea. Fortunately, OpenAI just put this code out so we can use it. Additionally, there's this tokens per name. We can provide a name attribute or a name property in every message. I don't really do this, but you can, and they're counted differently. So tokens per name in 3.5 Turbo is just ignored. In GPT-4, every name is 1 token. And then, if we look at the actual logic here, it loops over every message in our messages array, and it adds in that set number of tokens into the overall number, right? So it's going to, if we're talking about GPT-4, it will add 3 for this, but then it loops over all of the values in each message, and it encodes each of them, finds the length of that, and adds that number of tokens into the total number of tokens. So it will encode this, and however many tokens that is, it will encode this, add that number of tokens, plus the set number of tokens per message, which is 3 in GPT-4. Fortunately, we just use this function and it will tell us. So if we try this, let's use our example messages, and let's provide, what should we do? Let's start with 3.5. So our function is called num tokens from messages, and then I'll provide my example messages array, which is just right here. It's 6 different messages, and then the encoding will be GPT 3.5 turbo. It's 127 tokens when we're talking about this example messages with GPT 3.5 turbo. When we use GPT-4, it's 129 tokens. So there's a difference. Not to mention that there's a huge difference if I was just trying to count the number of tokens of the actual prompt text, and if I was using the completion API, not the chat format, then it would be way fewer tokens because we're billed per message in addition to the content of the tokens. But if we want GPT-4 and GPT 3.5 turbo, as we know, we don't have a choice. Now let's just verify if this is accurate or not. So what I'm going to do is just import OpenAI real quick. Okay, so I've imported OpenAI, and now I'm going to just make a chat completion. So chat completion.create, and I'll use GPT-4. So model is GPT-4, and then I'm going to provide my messages as, I'll just use the example messages right here. So when we counted the number of tokens using the function from OpenAI, it said with GPT-4, we're talking about 129 tokens for that whole list of messages. Let's see if that is correct. So I'm going to set max tokens just to be 1. I don't really want a response. I mean, we're not going to use it. If I shrink it down, I'll be billed the least amount possible. And if we look at what it says here at the bottom, under usage in our response, completion tokens is 1. Prompt tokens was 129, which matches exactly what we got here. So this is useful because, like I said, if we're writing a book summarizer and we have a limit, if I go to the book, of 4,096 tokens, which is the context window for GPT 3.5 turbo, I need to know if I'm using the messages format, I can't just take this piece of text all the way up to 496 tokens, for example. I could calculate that, but then I would exceed the number of tokens if I tried to provide all of that text at once. Even if it's exactly the correct number of tokens, it's not accounting for the fact that messages are billed, right? Each message is going to be 4 tokens for GPT 3.5 turbo. So we can use this function from the documentation to calculate the correct number of tokens that OpenAI will bill us and will count using the messages format. It's not as straightforward as just the number of tokens in the text. It also counts tokens per message. All right, so it's kind of a lot, but once you have that function written or copied from OpenAI, it's simple to get that number of tokens. Give it a list of messages in the correct format, give it a model, and it will count the tokens.